Welcome back. So I'm currently studying for the MCAT and I've been turning full chapters of notes into one-page mind maps. These maps help me review faster and visualize complex topics clearly, also see how they connect to each other. This video is a part of my MCAT Mind Mapstery series on my Substack. I'll also be posting detailed breakdowns and updates about my MCAT journey on my Substack, so if you want to follow along, check out the link down below. Let's get started. So today we're going to be talking about the respiratory system. So the main functional unit in the respiratory system are the lungs. These are the organs that assist in gas exchange. And you might be asking what kinds of gases? Well, we're talking about carbon dioxide and oxygen. You'll see this image a lot on the internet when you look up the respiratory system. So essentially it's the foundation of everything we're going to be explaining. The respiratory system's main job is bringing in oxygen and removing carbon dioxide. There's a key connection. Getting rid of carbon dioxide is not just about exhaling waste gas. It's a chemical process that directly affects the acidity of your blood. So by understanding airflow, we can also understand how our bodies control pH. Now you might be asking, why is pH control important? I had that question myself. So we have enzymes in our body, right? They are biological catalysts, and they speed up essential biochemical reactions like digestion and metabolism. So pH control is crucial because changes in pH can alter an enzyme's shape, particularly its active site, preventing it from binding to its substrate and catalyzing a reaction. So the respiratory system is really cool in that way. It's not just about airflow and breathing. It's also about pH control. So we can talk about that more. First, let's talk about airflow. So let's follow one breath of air step by step. So you can use this visual to help you understand the path of air. As you can see, air enters through your nose and your mouth. The nose warms, filters, and humidifies it, and then it passes it through the pharynx, and then the larynx. Next, air moves down the trachea. The trachea splits into two bronchi, one for each lung. Each branch keeps dividing into smaller airways called bronchioles, until it ends in clusters of tiny balloon-like sacs called alveoli. And these alveoli, they kind of look like balloons, and they're surrounded by vasculature. This entire branching system increases surface area massively. So by the time air reaches the alveoli, there's plenty of room for gases to move in and out efficiently. So the alveoli are where the real magic happens. They kind of look like this. The alveoli are microscopic air sacs, and they're surrounded by networks of capillaries, which are tiny blood vessels. Each alveolus has very thin walls, separated from the blood by a few layers of cells, and this is called the respiratory membrane. It's thin on purpose so gases can easily move across of it. In the alveolus, oxygen pressure is high. In the deoxygenated blood, oxygen pressure is low. So oxygen diffuses naturally from the alveolus to the blood, moving from high to low pressure. At the same time, carbon dioxide pressure is high in the blood than in the alveolus. So carbon dioxide diffuses the opposite way, from the capillary into the alveolus to be exhaled. No energy is needed for this. The movement is driven purely by pressure gradients. And that simple swap, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, is what keeps every cell in your body alive. So you might be asking, how does blood get into the lung? So deoxygenated blood, it returns through the superior and the inferior vena cava into the right atrium of the heart, passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and is then pumped through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries that lead to the lungs. Inside the lungs, these arteries, they branch into tiny capillaries that, like we said, wrap tightly around the alveoli. And here, oxygen from the air inside the alveoli diffuses into the blood, while carbon dioxide moves out to be exhaled. The newly oxygenated blood then gathers into the pulmonary veins, flows to the left side of the heart, and is pumped through the aorta to deliver oxygen to every cell in the body before the cycle repeats. This is essentially how we can get oxygen-rich blood to be delivered to our tissues. Okay, now let's talk about how air actually moves in and out. So each lung is covered by these two membranes right here, the visceral pleura attached to the lung surface and the parietal pleura lining the chest wall. Between them is a thin layer of pleural fluid. This fluid keeps them moving smoothly, but also sticks them together. Okay, so when you inhale, these things happen. This is the diaphragm. it contracts and it moves down. External intercostal muscles, they lift the ribs up and out. And the chest cavity expands, increasing its volume. Because the pleura are connected, we talked about that, expanding the chest pulls the lungs outward as well. And when the volume increases, pressure inside the lungs decreases because remember, pressure and volume are inversely related. So air from the outside, where pressure is higher, flows into the lungs naturally. This is called negative pressure ventilation. Air flows in not because you suck it in, but because the lungs, they create a space for it. When you exhale, this process is reversed. Essentially, the diaphragm relaxes, the ribs fall, and the lungs recoil inward, increasing pressure so air gets pushed out. So to review, breathing is a process of moving air in and out of the lungs so gas exchange can occur, bringing oxygen in and removing carbon dioxide. When you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and the chest expands. Negative pressure draws air into the lungs. When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and air is pushed out as the lungs recoil. We can use this graph to better understand how breathing works, but keep in mind that there is some vocabulary that you need to know. I think that this vocabulary should not be memorized, rather understood. So I'm going to talk about it when I talk to you about the graph. So if you breathe in normally right now, that's a tidal volume. That's the volume of air in a normal quiet breath. If you breathe in until you can't get any more air into your lungs, now you're talking about the inspiratory reserve volume. So the inspiratory reserve volume is essentially the volume of air that can be forcefully inspired after a tidal breath. Okay, and when you talk about both of these things together, you're talking about the inspiratory capacity. This is essentially, like I said, the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume. So now if you breathe in normally and then breathe out until you feel like you can't breathe out anymore, you're talking about the expiratory capacity, which includes the expiratory reserve volume, which is volume of air that can be forcefully expired after a tidal breath. Now if you breathe in normally and breathe in all the way, and then breathe out all the way, you're talking about the vital capacity. This is the difference between the highest and the lowest lung volumes. You will notice that even after you breathe out all the way, your lungs still have some air. So even if you breathe out all the way, your lungs, they will still have some air left in them. This is called the residual volume. This is what keeps your lungs from collapsing. So another thing you should note, now that we've talked about how breathing works and the different things involved, we will note that the alveoli are also prevented from caving in on themselves via surfactant. This essentially surrounds these alveoli and it decreases the surface tension inside of them. And essentially, that decreases the pressure in them and stops them from caving in on themselves. Together, these volumes and these capacities, they describe how your lungs expand, contract, and maintain a constant reserve with every breath. Okay, here's now where I think the respiratory system gets more interesting. So, as you know, every cell in your body, it produces carbon dioxide as a waste product of metabolism. That carbon dioxide, it moves into your blood and eventually reaches your lungs to be exhaled. But before it leaves, it dissolves in your plasma and it reacts with water. That reaction forms something called carbonic acid, which is a weak acid that can quickly break apart into hydrogen ions, which, as you know, make blood more acidic, and bicarbonate ions, which act as a buffer. This reaction is the key to understanding why breathing directly controls your blood's pH. So let's break that chemistry down. So, as you know, you need to control your blood's pH, right? We talked about that. And that's because your enzymes in your body, for them to function, they need to be at the right pH, okay? And so your respiratory system, like I said, it maintains that blood pH. And it does that via something called the bicarbonate buffer system. Bicarbonate ions, they are like this. And a buffer is a solution that resists pH changes. So as we just talked about, you can ignore this writing and this purple here for a minute, okay? Just pay attention to the central equation right here first. So this carbon dioxide, it comes from metabolism, like I said. It meets with water in your blood, okay? And an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, it helps them to combine to form carbonic acid. And this is what carbonic acid looks like. Okay, so again, just pay attention here, okay? So carbonic acid, it's unstable. So it quickly splits into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. This is part of the reason why we call this the bicarbonate buffer system. And so hydrogen ions, as you know, they control acidity. So more hydrogen ions, it means a lower pH, which means the blood is more acidic. And since breathing, it controls how much carbon dioxide is in the blood. It indirectly controls how many hydrogen ions are formed because of this equation, right? This is essentially the foundation of respiratory pH regulation. Now we're going to be talking about acidosis and alkalosis. I'll come back to this purple writing here. So acidosis and alkalosis, they describe imbalances in the body's pH. Basically how acidic or basic the blood becomes. And the lungs, they play a major role in correcting both through breathing. Acidosis, it happens when the blood becomes too acidic. Lower pH, okay? Meaning there's too much hydrogen ions or carbon dioxide, often from hypoventilation, or metabolic buildup of acids like lactic acid. In response, the brain signals the lungs to breathe faster and deeper. That's why you breathe heavier, okay? Which removes more carbon dioxide, lowering CO2, shifts the chemical imbalance, and it reduces that acidity, and then raising pH back to normal. Alkalosis is essentially the opposite of this. It's when blood becomes too basic, often from hyperventilation or loss of acids, and the body compensates by slowing your breathing down, allowing carbon dioxide to then build up. Okay, so this is building up, which increases carbonic acid, right? Because everything moves to the right, okay, and brings pH back down. In this way, the lungs act as a rapid response system, adjusting ventilation within minutes to keep blood pH tightly balanced. So let's review. When you hold your breath or breathing slows, carbon dioxide builds up in the blood. The reaction shifts to the right, making more hydrogen ions. Blood, therefore, becomes more acidic, and it has a lower pH. When you breathe faster, like during exercise or when you're anxious, you exhale more CO2. The reaction shifts left to accommodate for that, and it reduces the amount of hydrogen ions, and blood becomes more basic, which means it has a higher pH. Your brainstem is what constantly monitors blood CO2 levels using chemoreceptors. If CO2 rises way too high, it sends signals to increase your breathing rate. If CO2 drops too low, it slows your breathing down. So every breath you take is your body's way of fine-tuning its own chemistry, which is so cool. Okay, so now I'm going to explain what all this purple writing means. So think about when you're late to class and you start sprinting. When you sprint and can't get enough oxygen, your muscles, they make energy without oxygen because oxygen delivery can't keep up. So your cells, they switch to anaerobic respiration, producing lactic acid. This process also releases extra hydrogen ions, making your muscles more acidic. In your blood, the extra H plus combines with bicarb to form carbonic acid, which quickly splits into water and carbon dioxide. Your body senses the rising acidity and the extra CO2, so you breathe faster and deeper to get rid of that CO2, which helps return your blood pH to normal. What started as simple airflow is actually a full chemistry-based system. Every inhale and exhale isn't just about exchanging gases, it's about stabilizing your body's internal environment. Kind of a balance that keeps your enzymes functioning and keeps your pH in control, which allows your muscles to contract properly and your brain to work at its peak. So therefore, breathing is both physiology and chemistry. Hopefully, this mind map helped you understand that a little bit better. From airflow mechanics to chemistry, your lungs don't just move air. Think beyond that. They keep your blood chemically balanced every second. If you found this helpful, follow my Substack from the link down below and take a deep breath. You're not just memorizing facts, you're learning how the body keeps itself stable. And now you know all about the respiratory system.